They died in silence, not on the battlefields, but in shame, fear, and collapse. When the Third Reich fell in 1945, it wasn't just the generals, ministers, or soldiers who went down. So too did the women who had lived by their side, the wives of Nazi power, those who enjoyed the luxuries, the influence, and the recognition while Europe bled. Their end was the mirror of the Reich, swift, brutal, and without redemption. They shared the glory of power and the punishment of collapse. Some died alongside their husbands, faithful until the last second. Others survived, but their lives became a slow torture of rejection, poverty, and scorn. Behind every Nazi uniform there was a woman, and behind every woman, a story that ended with the same taste of tragedy. This was the brutal end of the wives of Nazism, the women who thought they were living at the pinnacle of the world, and ended up being the most painful portrait of the fall. Eva Braun was the most well-known, the constant shadow of Adolf Hitler. For years she was his secret lover, hidden from the public eye while he built his empire, and all of Europe trembled at his speeches. She lived a life of luxury at the Alpine Berghof residence, surrounded by photographers, parties, and privileges, but always confined to the role of the invisible companion. Although she was not officially his wife, everyone in the most intimate circles knew who she really was. In the final days of the Reich, when Allied bombs fell on Berlin and the world they knew was crumbling, Eva made a decision that would forever mark her story. On April 30th, 1945, amidst the darkness and chaos of the bunker, she married Hitler. It was an impromptu ceremony, with exhausted witnesses, flickering lights, and an atmosphere of defeat. Hours later, she swallowed a cyanide capsule. He shot himself in the temple. Their bodies were burned with gasoline according to his will. There was no grave, no mourning, no flowers. Eva Braun died at just 33 years old, turned to ashes and a symbol of the total collapse of Nazism. Her life was extinguished beside the man who had kept her in the shadows, and her death sealed the tragedy of a devotion that surpassed love, that of fanaticism. Magda Goebbels was different, but equally tragic. She was considered the first lady of the Reich, elegant, cultured, and devoted to the Führer. Married to Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, she was one of the most influential women of the regime. She had direct access to Hitler and sincerely believed he was Germany's savior. For Magda, the Third Reich was not just a nation, it was a faith. When the war ended, Magda refused to flee. She believed a world without Hitler should not exist. On May 1st, 1945, as the Soviets closed in on the bunker, she made a decision that horrified even the most fanatical. Together with her husband, she poisoned her 6 children with cyanide capsules. Afterwards, they both went out into the garden and committed suicide. The images of their bodies and the small corpses laid out became one of the darkest symbols of the end of Nazism. Now, that deserves you subscribing to the channel. Let's continue. Magda Goebbels was remembered as the fanatical mother who sacrificed her children for a dead ideology. Some historians describe her as a woman blinded by devotion, others as a victim of brainwashing. But the truth is that her end left no room for compassion. Her act was a mixture of madness, desperation, and absolute fanaticism. Emmy Göring, for her part, experienced a different kind of fall. She was an actress, glamorous, wife of the Luftwaffe commander, Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful and corrupt men of the regime. For years, she enjoyed a life of stolen luxuries, surrounded by confiscated art and endless banquets. In photos from that time, she always appeared radiant, dressed in silk, with jewels, smiling for the cameras, But that smile was erased when the war ended. Her husband was captured by the Allies, tried in the Nuremberg trials, and sentenced to death, though he killed himself before being hanged. Emmy was arrested, interrogated, and sentenced to prison. She spent a year behind bars, lost her fortune, her properties, and her civil rights. From a life among mansions, she went to washing her own clothes, cooking to survive. She ended her days in anonymity, without money and without friends, remembered only as the wife of the Reich's thief. Lina Heydrich knew ruin even before the end of the war. Her husband, Reinhard Heydrich, was one of the architects of the Holocaust, feared even within the Nazi Party for his brutality. In 1942, he was assassinated in Prague by members of the Czech resistance. His death was celebrated by the entire world, but for Lina, it was the beginning of hell. She publicly defended her husband, justified his crimes, and never showed remorse. She was subjected to denazification trials, lost her home, her reputation, and her place in society. However, she never changed her story. Until her death in 1985, she continued to assert that her husband had been a hero. She lived for decades in contempt, without prison, but with the worst possible punishment, being rejected by everyone. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, also bore the weight of the surname. Her husband was one of the men closest to Hitler, and his story is one of the strangest in Nazism. In 1941, he flew alone to Scotland with the intention of negotiating peace with the United Kingdom without authorization from the Führer. He was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Ilse never saw him free again. She spent over 40 years living alone, raising her son under the shadow of a traitor. Although he remained imprisoned until his mysterious death in 1987, she remained faithful, convinced that her husband had acted out of love for Germany. She lived under surveillance, isolated, and died in silence. Her punishment was the eternal wait. Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, the man closest to Hitler after Goebbels, also suffered a painful end. A convinced fanatic of the regime, she tried to flee to Austria when Berlin fell. The journey was chaotic and desperate. She ended up captured and confined to a convent. Sick with cancer, she died in 1946 at just 26 years old. Her husband disappeared amidst the collapse, and his body was found decades later. Gerda had no trial nor redemption, only a swift and tragic end, a reflection of the collapse of everything she had defended. Annelies von Ribbentrop, wife of the foreign minister, also knew humiliation. During the regime's years, she lived among diplomats, banquets, and meetings with foreign leaders. But in the Nuremberg trials, her husband was sentenced to the gallows. She lost her fortune, her properties, and her name. From living in high society, she went to sleeping in a cell. When she was released from prison, no one wanted to receive her again. She ended her days in poverty, repudiated, forgotten. All these women, each with their own story, represent the same tragedy: the cost of fanaticism. Eva Braun died for love of a monster. Magda Goebbels killed her children for a dead ideology. Emmy Göring lost everything she owned. Lina Heydrich became a symbol of contempt. Ilse Hess condemned herself to a life of solitude. Gerda Bormann faded away in a convent. Annelies von Ribbentrop died without redemption. None escaped the weight of time. Each was part of a system that ended up devouring them. They were not simply victims, nor just accomplices. They were witnesses to the horror from within. They lived in the heart of an empire of hate, and when that empire fell, they were dragged down with it. Their beauty, their status, and their power turned to dust. Jewels were exchanged for mud, palaces for prisons, parties for endless silences. These stories, although often ignored, show something that history repeats over and over again. Power, when built on fear and blood, always exacts a price. They paid it dearly, some with their lives, others with their sanity, and all with the eternal scorn of history. Their names barely appear in books, and when they do, there is no admiration, only a reminder. The shine of the Third Reich disappeared with the war, but its shadow still falls on the biographies of these women. Luxury turned to ash, devotion became a curse, and the names that were once untouchable now serve only as a warning. The end of these women was the exact reflection of the end of the regime they loved. Some died embracing madness, others survived to see their world crumble, but none escaped the inevitable. In their ruin was written history's hardest lesson. No one can love the monster and emerge unscathed. What do you think? Do you believe these women deserved the fate they had? Or were they also victims of the fanaticism they helped uphold? I read you in the comments, and if you are passionate about hidden stories and endings the world preferred to forget, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. There are still many truths that time has not wanted to reveal.